Nice, good. Good, that's good.
Prior to the joining of the Soviet Union, Ukraine had an independence movement and a war for independence that lasted for several years. And during this time, Ukraine had two different kind of iterations of independence. The first one was extremely pro-democratic, and this independent state was put down extremely violently by the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks exercised power across Ukrainian territory and violently incorporated Ukraine into the Soviet Union. And this happened in 1922. The Soviet Union took a series of maneuvers to try and violently pacify the Ukrainian population. Sometimes this was mass arrest, and perhaps the largest and most well-known event of Soviet violence against the Ukrainian people was a large famine that occurred in 1933-1934. Ukrainians use the term the Holodomor to discuss this because it is literally a terror famine or death by famine. We have lots of evidence that this famine was intentionally inflicted against the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian peoples, and that there were opportunities to stop the famine, which the Soviet Union did not take. This resulted in somewhere around 4 million deaths. The Ukrainian independence movement really started long before independence was actually achieved. The most well-known event leading up to independence was a line that developed from Lviv to Kyiv, in which individuals held hands the entire distance to signify Ukrainian independence. And they started to call for democratic measures, for peaceful Ukrainian demonstrations. And then as the Soviet Union began to kind of implode on itself, Ukraine was able to hold elections and vote for independence. Being a democracy when you've been inside of an autocratic state for a long time is a hard thing to do. It's not something that just naturally happens. And so Ukraine has been on the slow process of democratization since 1991. First major move towards democratization and open society we really see to shift governments occurs in the Orange Revolution. Here, Ukrainians are protesting falsified elections that were for a pro-Russian individual. And they fought to have those elections turned over. They successfully had those elections turned over and had their candidate put in. Unfortunately, the same candidate that was pro-Russian ran again 4 years later and was able to win an election then. This candidate, Yanukovych, was exceptionally pro-Kremlin, in many ways intimidated by Mr. Putin. And Putin wanted him to maintain connections with the Russian Federation, whereas the Ukrainian people wanted to develop their connections more closely with Europe. And this is how we got to Maidan. In 2014, actually 2013 is when it started, they had an option to start entering into conversations with the EU about a closer relationship. Most Ukrainians wanted this, and Yanukovych did not. And so he intentionally tanked the entire thing, and Ukrainians went to the streets to protest. And they said, hey, this is not what we want. We want to be free. We want to be democratic. We want to be part of Europe. This was exceptionally violent. Somewhere around 100 individuals were murdered in the streets of Kyiv protesting. And during this time, Putin took advantage of the situation and illegally occupied Crimea and began to back so-called separatists in Luhansk and Donetsk, which are two eastern regions in Ukraine. And it has been an active war zone since 2014. Mr. Putin, I think in many ways, and has imperial ambitions in Ukraine and beyond Ukraine. He perceives Crimea and Donetsk and Luhansk as perhaps a testing zone to see how much Western tolerance there was, to kind of test some of these approaches. What we're seeing here in the past few days is a violent escalation of that initial occupation in which he's targeting civilians, hospitals, and seriously trying to remove independent and sovereign Ukraine from the map.